My name is Helen Murray, and I am 63 years old. For most of my life, I believed being a good mother meant pouring myself out until there was nothing left. My story doesn't begin with betrayal, though. It begins with sacrifice, and with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life lived for others. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where everyone knew each other and reputation mattered. My parents weren't wealthy people. My father worked in a factory, my mother stayed home, and money was always tight. As a child, I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to work for it. At 14, I was babysitting for neighbours, scrubbing floors, and saving coins in a little tin box under my bed. By the time I finished high school, I had only one dream: to become a nurse. I wanted to heal, to comfort, to be useful. I put myself through nursing school by working nights as a waitress. I remember standing on aching feet for 12-hour shifts, the smell of frying oil clinging to my clothes, my textbook spread open on the counter whenever the diner grew quiet. I was young but determined, and I knew that every hour I worked would one day pay for a better future. I met my husband Peter in those years. He was tall, charming, and endlessly ambitious. He wanted to start his own construction company, and I wanted a family. Together, we believed we could do anything. We married, bought a small home, and before long, our children came into the world. David first, then Claire 2 years later. I remember holding David as a newborn, tiny and red-faced, his little fingers curling around mine. I whispered promises to him. Promises of love, of security, of sacrifice. I meant every word. When Claire was born, those promises doubled. I told myself my children would never know hunger, never wear hand-me-down shoes patched with tape the way I once had. I would give them everything. And I did. My husband's business never really took off the way he dreamed. He was good with his hands, but not with money. And the contracts didn't come steady. He was smart, charming, and sometimes manipulative. Still, I adored him. I cheered at his football games, stayed up late editing his college essays. And when he was accepted to university, I cried tears of pride. Claire, softer and gentler, took after me. She was thoughtful, artistic, and often the one who noticed when I was tired. She'd bring me tea after long shifts, sit with me quietly, and hold my hand. When Peter passed away unexpectedly in his 50s, the world tilted under my feet. His heart gave out one October morning, and suddenly I was both mother and father, provider and protector. The grief nearly crushed me, but I couldn't fall apart. My children needed me. So I worked harder, buried my pain under 12-hour shifts, and kept the house together with sheer willpower. David graduated, got a decent job, and married Melissa, a bright young woman from a comfortable family. She was polished, fashionable, always immaculate. She made David happy, and that was enough for me. They dreamed of a big house in the suburbs, the kind with vaulted ceilings and a backyard perfect for barbecues. But their savings weren't enough for the down payment. When David came to me, hesitant but hopeful, asking if I could help, I didn't think twice. By then, I had spent decades saving, scrimping, putting away what little I could. It wasn't much compared to wealthy families, but it was something. I wrote a check for $150,000. No questions, no strings, just love. I told him it was for his future, for his happiness, for the family he was building. I thought I was giving him security. I didn't realize I was also paying for my own eviction from his life. At first, everything seemed fine. They moved into their dream house, hosted parties, and posted smiling pictures on social media. I visited sometimes, bringing homemade meals, offering to babysit when their first child was born. Melissa thanked me politely, but I always felt like an outsider. I found out from Claire, who assumed I was too busy to attend, but no, I hadn't been invited at all. When I asked David why, his voice was sharp, almost rehearsed. "Mum, Melissa thinks you make her uncomfortable. This is our family now. You'll have to accept that. No apology, no hesitation, just cold dismissal." That was the night something inside me cracked. That was the night I stopped being his mother in action and started being his ATM. And that was the night I knew it had to end. I didn't shout at David that night. I didn't cry or beg him to reconsider. I simply stood there, listening to my own son speak words that cut sharper than any knife. He was calm, composed, and completely unmoved by the pain in my eyes. Melissa stood behind him, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin smile. She didn't even need to speak. Her victory was clear. She had his loyalty, his obedience, and I was nothing more than a shadow in their picture-perfect home. I drove back to my modest house in silence. The roads blurred beneath the headlights as memories washed over me. The years I had worked to keep food on our table. The nights I had stayed up sewing clothes. The mornings I left before sunrise and returned long after dark. All of it for the boy who now told me I was no longer part of his family. When I arrived home, I set my purse down, walked to the old oak desk in the corner of my living room, and opened the top drawer. Inside were files I had kept meticulously organized for decades. Birth certificates, insurance policies, receipts, deeds, bank statements. And tucked among them were the documents that tied me to David's new home. The deed, the co-signed loan agreements, the check receipts. I ran my fingers over them, remembering the day I wrote that check. David's face had lit up with gratitude. Melissa's smile had been polite but restrained. I had felt proud, certain that I was securing my son's future. I didn't know then that I was buying my way out of his life. That night, I sat in my chair and thought long and hard. Anger surged in me like a storm, but I didn't scream. I didn't call Claire to vent. I didn't slam doors or break dishes. The paperwork was signed within the hour. By the time I left the bank, I felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't begged. I had simply acted. Quietly, firmly, decisively. 2 weeks later, the phone rang. It was David, his voice frantic. "Mom, what did you do? The bank says our mortgage payments doubled. They're saying we're at risk of default. This isn't funny." I sipped the tea I had just brewed, the steam rising against my face. "I just stopped paying for a home I wasn't welcome in," I said calmly. There was silence on the other end. Then anger. "You can't do this to us." "I didn't do this to you," I replied softly. "You did." He hung up on me. In the weeks that followed, the cracks began to show. Melissa's glossy Instagram posts shifted from pictures of lavish dinners and sparkling new outfits to vague quotes about perseverance and struggle. The designer handbags disappeared, sold quietly online. David picked up late-night shifts, exhaustion lining his face. Their dream home, the one I had paid for, began to look less perfect when the bills piled up and the arguments started leaking through the walls. I watched from a distance, saying nothing. Claire visited often, bringing flowers, checking in on me, sharing laughter over cups of coffee. She never once asked for money. Her love was simple, honest, untainted by expectation. She reminded me that family wasn't about blood alone. It was about respect, kindness, and reciprocity. One evening, not long after another tense phone call from David, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Melissa stood there, mascara streaked down her cheeks, eyes wild with desperation. "You've ruined us," she spat, her voice shrill. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "We can't keep up. We're drowning." I stood in the doorway, calm. I didn't invite her in. "I didn't ruin you," I said evenly. "I just stepped out of the role you wrote for me without my consent." Her fists clenched at her sides. For a moment, I thought she might strike me. But instead, she turned and stormed back to her car. The tires screeched as she sped away into the night. For months, the pattern repeated. Calls from David that swung between anger and pleading. Messages filled with guilt, bargaining, manipulation. "Mum, don't you care about your grandson? He needs stability. He needs you." Of course I cared. I cared deeply. But I cared about myself too, and for once in my life, that came first. I had given everything. My time, my energy, my health, my savings. And what had it earned me? A cold dismissal, exclusion, and disrespect. No more. Their house began to crumble under the weight of unpaid bills. The garden grew wild. The cars sat neglected in the driveway. The shine dulled from every corner of their lives. Eventually, the inevitable came. They sold the house. The house I had bought. The house I had been uninvited from. When Claire told me they had moved into a modest apartment across town, I felt no glee, no vindication. I planted roses, lavender and tomatoes, watching them sprout slowly, reminding myself that growth takes time. Neighbours began stopping by, complimenting the blooms, and for the first time in years, I found myself smiling freely. Claire visited often. She'd bring over fresh pastries from a bakery she liked, or sometimes just sit with me, painting her nails, while we talked about nothing and everything. She never asked for money, never hinted at favours. Her love was uncomplicated, pure, and it soothed the raw edges of my soul. One afternoon, she said, "Mum, I'm glad you finally put yourself first." Her words nearly brought me to tears. For so long, I had defined myself only through sacrifice, through giving. To have my daughter recognise that I was worthy of care too, it felt like a balm on an old wound. David, on the other hand, became more of a ghost. His calls dwindled. Sometimes months would pass before I heard from him. When he did call, it was usually short, awkward, and strained. The boy who once clung to my hand at the doctor's office was now a man who couldn't even say thank you. Still, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed impossibly still, I would think of him. I'd wonder if he sat in that cramped apartment, staring at bills or arguing with Melissa, and thought of me. Did he ever remember the nights I stayed awake to soothe his fevers? Did he think of the hours I worked to pay for his college? The sacrifices I made to put food on the table? The check I wrote without hesitation so he could have his dream house? Or did he just remember the day I walked away? Regret tugged at me sometimes, but I refused to let it root itself in my heart. I reminded myself over and over. I hadn't abandoned him. He had pushed me out. I had simply drawn a line where none had existed before. Melissa never contacted me again after that night she showed up at my doorstep, screaming and desperate. I imagined she blamed me for everything. The loss of the house, the unravelling. Claire encouraged me every step of the way. She hung one of my paintings in her apartment and bragged about it to her friends. Her pride in me filled the hollow places David's silence had left behind. Months rolled into a year, and I realised something I never thought I'd admit. I was happier without David's constant demands. It hurt to acknowledge that, but it was true. Sometimes love doesn't disappear, but it changes shape. Mine had shifted into something quieter, something more self-protective. When I did see David again, briefly, at a distant cousin's wedding, he looked older, wearier. He avoided my gaze at first, but eventually he walked over. His words were stilted, awkward. "Hi, Mum." "How have you been?" I smiled gently. "I've been well." There was so much more I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him I loved him, that I missed him, that I wished things had been different. But I also wanted him to understand that love without respect is hollow, that I could not continue to play the role of silent benefactor in his life. So I said nothing more. He shifted uncomfortably, nodded and drifted back to Melissa, who still looked at me with thinly veiled disdain. I watched them leave together, and though part of me ached, another part of me felt strong. Stronger than I had in years. Now, as I sit in my quiet home, with the smell of lavender wafting in from the garden, I reflect on it all. The sacrifices, the betrayal, the silence, the revenge. I realise that revenge doesn't always have to be loud or destructive. Sometimes, the most powerful form of revenge is simply reclaiming your dignity, refusing to be used, and walking away with your head held high. I don't regret my choice. Not for a second. Because what I gained was far greater than what I lost. I gained peace. I gained freedom. And I gained myself. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't fire or